Welcome to Reading the Gospels Together, and today we begin our brand new series on the Gospel of John. Now, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which we've covered, and if you missed those, the videos are all available on our website, are called the Synoptic Gospels, literally meaning they all see things the same way. But John is different and in many ways more complex, and as a result, we're going to be taking things a bit more slowly. 3 sessions per week posted on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. This will give everyone more time to digest the material and to do preparatory reading and reflection, and also more time for me to prepare these studies. Now, the best way to benefit from these studies is to read the chapter in question before watching, and then to watch the video, and then to read the chapter again afterwards. This should go a long way towards locking the words and deeds of Jesus into your mind and help you understand what is often a pretty tricky gospel. See, John's audience is from a tradition and a time much different than our own, and sometimes what would have been clear to them is baffling to us. The goal of this study is to break through those cultural, philosophical, and linguistic barriers and to help us follow John as he paints a deeply three-dimensional portrait of Jesus for us. Now, that being said, there's some basic questions to answer. Who is John? Who wrote this gospel? And when? Why was it written and where? And why are these questions important to answer in the first place? Well, if someone is telling you a very important story, one that's going to impact your life, you want to know who that person is and where they got their information. You want to know if the information is current. When did you hear this? When did this happen? And those are 2 questions you'd want answers to right off the bat. You'd also want to know why they're telling you. Are they adding information or are they correcting information that's already out there? For instance, if a person tells you there's now a 100% effective vaccine for COVID, the crisis is over. All right. Now, before you throw away your mask and start going to crowded movie theaters, you want to know who that person is and where they got this information. If it's Dr. Heather Morrison, who's reporting on behalf of the Center for Disease Control, that's one thing. If it's some random person you're waiting in line with at Walmart who heard it on a YouTube conspiracy video, that's another thing altogether. We need these answers to evaluate the trustworthiness of the information. So, again, who wrote the Gospel of John, and when, and where, and why? And if you just stick with me for this introduction, you'll get some important and interesting answers to these questions. So, the most important evidence that we have about the Gospel of John is from our friend Papias. We've talked about him before. He was the bishop of Hierapolis in south-central Turkey, famous for its hot water baths and mineral springs. Now, Papias lived from about 65 to 145 AD, dying in his 80s, which was a ripe but not rare age back then. If you made it past the various disease years and war years and all the rest of it, you had as good a chance of living into your 80s as you do today. Now, he was known to be a companion of Polycarp, who was one of the most prominent early Christians, Polycarp himself was an associate of the author of the 4th Gospel and the little letters called 1, 2, and 3 John. Now, Papias was firmly of the opinion that if something or someone was to be believed, you better talk to them face to face, or talk to somebody else known to be reliable who talked to that original source. And Papias dedicated his life to seeking out such eyewitness testimony. Like our friend Luke, Papias was kind of an early version of an investigative reporter, convinced that hearing was far better than reading secondhand. As Papias wrote, we have his words recorded by our friend Eusebius, who was the historian of the church in the 4th century. Papias wrote, "For I imagined that what was to be got from books was not so profitable to me as what came from the living and abiding voice." So when Papias wanted to know about Jesus, whose death and resurrection happened 30 or more years before Papias was born, Papias tried to get his best to get as close to the source as possible. He searched the known world for those who had followed Jesus, or who had followed those who had followed Jesus. He even makes a list of those with whom he had these conversations, the companions of the apostles themselves. He said, I asked minutely after their sayings, what Andrew or Peter said, or what was said by Philip or Thomas, or by James, or by John, or by Matthew, or by any other of the Lord's disciples. Now, Papias even managed to seek out the two oldest surviving first-hand followers of Jesus, a man named Aristion, about whom we know little, and a man known as the presbyter or the elder John, who is very likely the Apostle John, the author of the Gospel of John itself. Now, chronologically, this is possible. We know from church records that the Apostle John lived into his 90s. If he had been 18 or 20 when he began following Jesus, he easily could have lived into the early years of 100 AD. Now, Papias would have been in his early 20s when he would have first met and interviewed the Apostle John. And they almost certainly would have met. Papias, as the bishop of Hierapolis, would have been based in the same general area of Western Turkey as John, who was based in Ephesus. John had supervision over many of those churches. It's entirely possible that John himself appointed Papias to the task. Now, Papias tells us that the Gospel of John was completed and distributed among the churches in the later years of John's life, during the time Papias knew him. This is probably somewhere between 85 and 90 AD. Papias adds, typical of his reliance on accurate first-hand testimony, that John's gospel was written down accurately at John's dictation. That would have been very important for Papias. And then those dictations were put together by John's recorders and compilers. It's not as though John was sitting down at a desk and writing out the whole Gospel of John chapter by chapter. He was dictating it, and then he had a team who was putting it together. Now, Papias himself is even credited by other early church witnesses as being one of those compilers of the writers of the writings of John, who together organized those dictated testimonies into the gospel that we have today. Those who did the gathering of John's writing and testimony into this gospel, every once in a while they peek out from behind the curtain, as it were. And they say, as at the crucifixion, as an aside, he who saw this has testified so that you also may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. Or as in John 21, this disciple is the one who testifies to these events and has recorded them here, and we know that his account of these things is accurate. And so there we have the dictating, the editing, and the compiling team saying, we know John. John was there, and what John is telling us, what he testified to, we know is accurate. Accurate because John saw it and heard it and was even there at the cross. He's a star witness with first-hand knowledge, the compilers tell us, of the life and words of Jesus. Now, John himself in his letters writes about the importance of his first-hand knowledge of Jesus. In one of his letters found in the New Testament, which we call 1 John, he tells us this: we proclaim to you the one who existed from the beginning, whom we have heard and seen. We saw him with our own eyes and touched him with our own hands. He is the word of life. We proclaim to you what we ourselves have actually seen and heard. You'll have to excuse that noise. There's a big paper shredding machine going on from the DVA right outside my office window. Now, Papias is not the only witness to the authorship of the gospel. Eusebius quotes Clement of Alexandria, who shortly after Polycarp's time wrote, John, aware that the outward facts had been set out in the other gospels, was encouraged by his disciples and divinely motivated by the Spirit, and composed a spiritual gospel. This is Clement's account. Now, Irenaeus, a contemporary of both Papias and Clement, as well as a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, see how that's all interconnected right back to the source. Irenaeus affirmed that afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had also leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. Now that's great smoking gun stuff. We can't have a better statement than that. And Irenaeus is referring to John chapter 13, where we read, one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's how the Gospel of John refers to John. That's his editorial team giving him that respect. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and asked, "Ask him which one he means." Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Now, the importance of this reference is that Irenaeus clearly identifies the disciple whom Jesus loved as John, the author of the Gospel of John. And this identification is made by a man who himself was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John. That's a pretty direct line of authority. So, to wrap up, every single piece of evidence we have from those early days points to the Apostle John as the source of the gospel, written from Ephesus, possibly as late as 90 AD, to complement the other already existing gospels with material they did not include, providing an even more in-depth portrait of the life and words of Jesus. That's why it's important for us to read and study and respond to come to know Jesus better and better. We can trust this gospel and the Jesus we find in these pages. And I'm looking forward to doing this with you. Now, in the next section, we're going to quickly look at some highlights of this gospel, as well as what makes it a bit tricky in places to understand. We'll see you then.